Thank you so much, Dermot. Thank you to the IAF and everybody. It's a massive privilege actually to be here, and also slightly terrifying to be up first and be kind of framing some of the debate that we're going to be having through the day in terms of what we're even here to talk about. What is beyond participation? It's such a massive subject. It's so diverse. Where do we start? I still feel like I'm about 17, but I realise now that I'm old enough to have seen actually several cycles in how people talk about and practice and theorise around citizen participation in planning and architecture. There are these kind of cycles of discovery and rediscovery of ideas around citizen agency or community planning or community architecture or participatory planning or co-design or all of these words, but whatever they mean. It's a funny thing because each cycle seems to get sort of ossified into a set of best practice methodologies and reports and evaluations, and suddenly those get applied in this sort of unthinking way and stop having any sort of meaning whatsoever, and therefore we're forced to rediscover again and reinvent again, and kind of there's a whole other generation who comes up and says, why aren't we actually talking to people about this stuff? And that's quite interesting to me because it seems that it's so basic and so self-evidently effective and justified to involve people in the development and design of the places that they live in every day of their lives. And how does it so quickly become reduced to a set of meaningless gestures, really? Things that are just another thing to do, another step in the process to getting a project from start to finish. And I guess my practice is really, all my investigation into this area is really about how can we sort of stop that fatigue from happening, that fatigue on the part of the professional and that fatigue on the part of the citizen who sees just another consultation coming up, just another thing that probably isn't really going to affect anything. And, we wouldn't be here today in this room, so I'm kind of talking to you all as allies and as interested citizens, because we wouldn't all be here if we didn't think this is a really good thing to do. We should be talking to people. It is effective, it makes better places, it is fundamentally democratic in its outlook. But we also wouldn't be in this room, because most of us are living in at least relatively participatory democracies of one sort or another. We wouldn't be here if those democracies were really functioning that well, because actually we wouldn't need to be having this conversation. And so I suppose I'm kind of interested in where the sort of practice that I do and the sort of practice we all do sits within a scale of engagement from the political structures through to the everyday. I don't really have any answers. I don't have the answer to fixing the system, but I'm just going to talk about, I suppose, some of the few big influences in my practice, and then a few of the things that I try to do in my projects. They're quite intimate and quite practical, and they're really just about trying to see how we bridge our competing interests in the search for the common good, and where that might lead us. The first person I'm actually going to talk about my learning from, and it's very sentimental, I'm sorry, I apologise in advance, is actually my father. It's very cheesy, but he ended up, through the death of his father when he was only 17, going into a line of business that he actually had no intention of ever going into. He was a hippie child of the 60s, and business was kind of a bad thing. But anyway, he had to go into it, and he didn't want to be there, but he went into it. And after a while, he realised that his real interest lay in the practice of business and how this company, which was a relatively small independent, big, employed 300 people, but not huge. It was in a small rural town, and it was a major employer and a huge part of the local identity, but in its sector, which was dominated by international conglomerates, it was under threat. And he was interested in how to keep it alive, and he became interested in how a business roots in its locality and talks to people there and means something to people there, as well as being a profitable enterprise making good products. I found this paper a few months ago, which he wrote when he was nearly retired in 2005, and it struck me that actually one of the things he explores when he talks about a good company were things that I must have imbibed in a very fundamental manner. And at the bottom of the first page, he makes a statement, which I guess is a touchstone from which he starts. As I walk over my office threshold, I no longer cease to be a social being, and I become a businessman. And I think for me, this is a very fundamental thing, that we are not just professionals, we are also just people. And if you treat everybody with whom you come into contact as you would your friends and family, then that's a really kind of good starting point. We're not just different just because we happen to have different roles, different jobs. He also asks this question, which I think is very pertinent. You know, how do we speak to each other? How do we acknowledge each other's hopes, fears? How do we make conversations real and just not formulaic? And I think this statement, which is also from this little paper I found of his, which to me, again, is another thing that I must have somehow spoken about with him, because it's definitely become something that's central to the way I see my work. You know, it's not about structures or methodologies of quote-unquote engagement, participation, consultation. It really is about simple human relationships that are nurtured and explored in a simple human way. The second person I just want to bring in is someone I actually never met, but whose work has been a huge influence on me. The architect and educator, and some of you will probably know of him, who's called Sambo Mokbey, who is in the United States. For those of you who don't know him, he founded an extraordinary program called the Rural Studio, which works in rural Alabama in the United States. And I had the privilege of working there for a year after I did my first degree in architecture. In fact, around the same time my father was writing this paper, I was in Alabama learning to build things. Sambo thought that if you want to learn architecture as a student, you need to actually do it. You actually need to do it properly, actually in real life, not just in a studio. You need to learn what it means to work with a client, design, build stuff. So at the Rural Studio, he tore up the arcane power structures of education and uprooted a bunch of architecture students pretty much sort of under the radar, if you like, of the university from their nice clean campus, and they go and live hours away in this tiny, tiny impoverished town in the heart of a huge and impoverished region, which is pretty much abandoned by any form of welfare state. And there, these middle-class, mostly white American kids design and build for the mostly black people who live there. Houses, community projects, parks, fixing people's roofs up, as well as creating beautiful and durable buildings that get published in journals around the world. And through this, they and myself when I was there, I think I learned many very valuable things: how to speak honestly, how to listen openly to people who come from backgrounds that are unimaginably different, and how pieces of wood can go together to make something that actually changes someone's life chances, that has a real impact. I was going to show you a few images from there, and then actually I thought no, because when you only show one or two, it sort of is that poverty porn that is just awful. But, you know, this is the world's richest nation, and there are people living in shacks with raw sewage running past their front door, so it's a pretty extreme scenario. But Sambo said many very wise and important things, and it's hard to pick one or two, but you know, this really stuck with me from reading his work and from the practice of the Rural Studio, which is to say, actually it is about your compassion, it is about your empathy as a human being that makes your architecture really good. And this one also, which I really like, because it speaks volumes about the commitment and energy he brought to his personal work in this area. And the work that we all have to do is actually, it is a lot of work. You do have to go to war, you do have to kiss your wife goodbye and you know, pack your bags and really commit. There's no two ways about it. Lastly, and close at home, I want to speak about a group, not an individual, and which did something quite stunningly extraordinary. And again, when I was very early on in my career, I came into contact with them because actually when I was a sort of baby architect just out of college, in my first job, I was involved with a project for them. And that's a group in London that some of you, well, those of you who come from the UK will know about probably, called Coin Street Community Builders. Amazingly, they were a group of normal people and citizens and people quite disenfranchised who managed to get hold of a piece of the most valuable real estate in the centre of our city, which is quite an extraordinary thing to do. They took it away from commercial development and they took it into not just community ownership, but actually a really kind of interesting form of cooperative ownership. And the ambition and quality of what they achieved there has stuck with me ever since. They blow the idea that working on a kind of community level is small scale or kind of cute or a bit fluffy or hairy. You know, they say, actually, we make big bits of city and we can make them differently. It doesn't have to be marginal. I was kind of astonished, actually, the other day. I had a master's student from the LSE who was interested in housing and through another contact of mine wanted to come and ask me some questions. And I mentioned these guys, and he actually didn't know about them. So I suddenly thought maybe there's another of these generational things where people don't know about them. So I thought I would just put them up here and put that name in the room. This is a plaque And I just love, I don't know if you can read it from this distance, but there's this really simple sentence on there that just says it is dedicated to public use. And I love the simplicity of that statement. So how do I take these people into the work that I do? In my professional life, I'm involved with a huge range of projects, from large-scale co-design to small-scale community builds, some pro bono work for local groups, some consultancy for government agencies. But coming back to the starting point of this, I'm also just a citizen. I'm also just a social being like everybody else, and I want to feel a sense of agency over my circumstances. So my starting point is all my work is empathy. I'm a pretty simple thinker. I'm afraid I'm not very good at these sorts of things. I don't like words like engagement, and I don't like these well-meaning lists, because they're written by people who've actually just never gone and talked to anybody in their life. I'm sorry, I don't like route maps very much. I don't like the idea that the particular character and requirements and makeup of a place can be sort of shoved into a predetermined process. I think this is the sort of same thing as my father talked about when he talks about arcane power structures. Actually, this is its own sort of arcane power structure. I prefer just to talk about involving people and seeing every project as different and every person is different, and how they want to be involved is different. I know that you probably want a greatest hits of sort of wonderful, successful projects to fill you with inspiration, but I find it really hard, if I'm honest, to look at my own projects and say, look, this is just brilliant. So I'm just going to talk about some of the things that I do in my projects, and through that, some of the projects you might get a glimpse of, and some of the things that I've learned. These are sort of observations from the coalface, if you like, of what I do day in, day out. Talking to people, pretty self-evident, isn't it? But when I say talking, I suppose in my world that really means talking, going to visit people in their living rooms and sit and have very many cups of tea and knock on doors of complete strangers who I have no idea whether they're in or out or interested or mad or, really needing help. Walking into shops and trying to interest them, mostly in a futile way, in what I'm doing. This man's called Doug. He's a resident on a housing estate that I'm working on at the moment as a facilitator for a co-design project. And every time I go to the estate, which is pretty often, probably every week, I have to go and have a cup of tea with Doug. He lives on the second floor. He's lived on this estate since it was built in the 1960s. In fact, he lived just in one of the terrace streets that was demolished for this estate. I talked to him about his cat, Lucy, his coach trips to the Isle of Wight, the leaking gutter on his block, how they still haven't fixed the external lighting. He sits in his flat and he looks out and he sees everything that happens on that estate, and if I walk across the estate, he will see me, so I cannot walk across the estate without going and having a cup of tea with him. But, that's really important, that I can just go and talk to him, not about what do you think about the project or, should we be building this or that here or there, but just talk to him as a human being. And he's not the only one. I have, a list of people like that on this project, and it grows every week, and I sit in living rooms and kitchens, and I hear stories. I hear the tenant on the estate who was rehoused from another estate undergoing regeneration. So it was what they call a decant, lovely word. And, she's having problems with her new neighbour across the hall. She had problems with her old neighbours in her old estate. She has health problems, and she's also teaching herself Russian, which is just amazing. And you would not know that if you didn't go and sit in her living room and notice the Russian dictionary sitting next to you on the sofa, and say, why have you got a Russian dictionary? There's the elderly woman whose daughter and her grandson are staying with her because their estate is also being redeveloped, and he has terrible asthma. The kid, he's a basketball player, but he has terrible asthma, and the dust of the construction makes it impossible for him to live there. Some of you from the UK will be familiar with this quote that became rather infamous after the Grenfell Tower fire, because this is what the leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council said when someone asked her whether she'd ever been in a tower block. I'm afraid I don't agree. I think it may not be relevant whether she was on the 21st or the 22nd or the 23rd floor, but, you do actually have to go and see people where they live and hear those stories. There is no shortcut, and it is relevant to whether you can design for them or understand them or talk to them, whether you actually have sat on a tower block and seen what the issues are and heard those stories. And yes, there's a bit of me that becomes a bit of a social worker. I speak to a woman who has a pile of unopened bills on her kitchen counter, and I ring the housing officer and I tell her she really needs to get someone to address, to help this woman with her unopened bill, because she's going to get evicted soon if she doesn't deal with those bills. I report broken toilets. I report fly tipping. This isn't being an architect, but if I don't do that, I'm just another bureaucrat who sticks to their brief. And as Sambo would have said, where's my compassion? And it's, within social housing, which is something I deal with a lot, it's pretty shocking how the cuts and all the political climate more widely makes the sort of interactions that those tenants have very impersonal, and it is go online and fill in a form, ring up the switchboard and navigate the telephone tree, and nobody actually talks to them. And I'm very aware when I come into my projects, I have a privilege. I am doing a project because a council or whoever has said to me, come and help us with this project. And so I can go back to the housing management and I can say, deal with this person's broken toilet or unopened bills or leaking gutter, because, if they won't trust me to be able to make some change on their behalf, how are they going to trust us to build 100 new homes on their doorstep with any form of integrity? If you can't solve the leaking gutter, why are we even starting to talk about how beautiful their estate could look in 10 years' time once they've been through 5 years of really disruptive construction work? We're all individuals, and we want to be respected and listened to as real people with histories, ambitions, and problems that are ours. But, speaking to them also puts them in, and this is where the crossover between the instrumental and the kind of political becomes interesting, because this is a sort of typical spread from my notebook after I've been to the estate, a list of contact details, email addresses, phone numbers, addresses, broken gutter and lighting issues. And these are now people who are in my net, so who I can go and talk to about the design of their place, because actually I've sat in their living room and I've talked to them about their broken gutter, and they know my face and they know my name and they have my mobile phone number, and I now work with them. And of course, it's not just individual citizens, it is talking to the other people who are agents in their areas: priests, rabbis, doctors, teachers, social club secretaries, gardeners, caretakers. I map them and I go out and see them, and it is a lot of footwork. And, as Sambo said, you kiss your wife goodbye. I don't have a wife, but I have a partner and I do have some children, and they're used to the fact that at the dinner table I will be answering my mobile phone to one of the community members or social organisations in the area who just happens to be that is the only time they can talk to me. This mapping leads me on to the second thing I want to talk about, which is data, and I think I think there's going to be some interesting discussions about this later in different forums, but we're also we're individuals, but we're part of this big social tapestry, and we have amazing data now. And data is powerful when we're talking about participation. We can compare I can go online and I can get all this data that says, how does my project area relate to the borough it's in, the city it's in, the region it's in? If my area is, 40% black and minority ethnic, and yet everybody who's turning up to talk to us is white, what are we doing wrong here? If we're talking about education and you're saying there's no problems, but the data is showing me that actually, although, there's a pretty good employment rate here, it's pretty interesting that there's a rather large number of people that don't have any qualifications whatsoever, so that employment's going to be pretty low grade. We can do something about that. It's a tool to talk to your clients and to say, give me resource to do this. Use the data. Use other sorts of data too, physical mapping, not making value judgments, just being like a scientist and putting this data out there and talking to people about it. And the best thing is when you draw these sorts of maps and you show them to real people out there and they go, that's not like that. You've shown that as green, that's not green. No, it's not right. And then you've really learnt something. I'm a big believer, just going back to that, I'm a big believer in open data and open mapping, and it's really amazing that we have open source data provision, but we need a lot more of it. And I think as a community, that's something that we can very practically advocate for. We have the London Data Store in London, which is amazing, but it's not enough. We need more of it. This, to me, is a really important thing that I've learned. So allies, just like in international diplomacy, allies, when we work, don't mean people who share your point of view. They're just people who, for whatever reason, are committed to working with you. And that tends to be through self-interest, and that is absolutely fine. Some of the best people, the best allies in your project are actually people who are really quite opposed to the project because they really want to talk to you about it. And I don't have a problem with seeing the instrumentalism of people's self-interest as intrinsic to the process of participation. I'm not expecting people to be doing this out of some kind of altruistic, selfless, and belief in a better world. And those critical voices are your best friends. Doug's actually a pretty good example. Doug, who I showed you earlier, he came to one of the early meetings and he told me quite, up front, he said, I love this estate and nothing should change here. Fine, but he has come to every single meeting that we've had of the monthly community group that we chair on this estate, bar one when he was sick in bed. And I've got another person who's a businessman who the only reason he replied to my letters and emails and knocking on doors was because he's been trying to get planning permission to extend his building next to this project for years and years and has not got planning permission. And he thinks that if he talks to me, I have some magical power to give him planning permission, which I obviously don't. But he's in the room and he's telling us things, and they are really good. This is a room of 150 people who came to a workshop recently that I ran for the Mayor of London. And they were interested in how to get some money out of the Mayor of London for community projects. And they're not unselfish people. They are all people with agendas. And those agendas are conflicting and can be quite parochial, but it's important that they are actually a huge groundswell of energy. So making sure that you get these people as your allies, not necessarily as your advocates, but as your allies, is amazing. This was a funny email I got a few weeks ago from a resident on a project who said, oh, why didn't these people come earlier? To which I answered, well, I don't really mind. And you just let people in whenever they turn up. And actually now these people are in the room and now they are allies. And it doesn't matter that they're a year late to the process. They can catch up. That's absolutely fine. Some of these people become advocates for your project, but you can't expect that. And as soon as you start to demand some kind of loyalty or advocacy from the people who you're talking to, they lose their independence. So I would say resist the demands from your clients to turn people into show ponies that can be trotted out for local TV or press or give quotes about how brilliant your process was. They should not become those people. That's our job. We're the professionals. We're the advocates. We're paid to be the lightning conductors for any trouble or dissent that comes our way. We don't put that onto the people who we're actually working with. I can take an enormous amount of lightning conductor. I can just smile and smile as people say the most terrible things. But, the people who we're working with, they have the right to be independent and at any point in the process to say, no, I step away from this. But, they need to be celebrated as well, and I think you can celebrate that in many different ways. Just back to talking again. It's amazing what happens when you get people from diverse walks of life together in a room together. And this is something that doesn't happen. People say, oh, why don't you start a Facebook group? This doesn't happen in a Facebook group. And one thing that I've learned is that I don't need to mediate this conversation too much if I can just put those people in that room together. This photo was taken in a really wonderful moment where just shortly after this, one resident in this group, one community member, kind of stood up and challenged one of the other community members who'd been dominating the discussion that day, and just said to him, what are you doing? Why are you talking so much here? It didn't need me to say that. Actually, the room can police itself, can find its own dynamic. And, one of the residents who came late to the process, in fact, one of the ones that we were talking about earlier, came and was very vociferous about his interests. And I said, well, come to the next meeting with the group and, you can just see all the stuff in a bit more detail. And he came, and it was astonishing to see him as a very privileged person, actually, in the local community in terms of social background, just kind of silenced by the dynamic in the room. He suddenly saw his concerns in this context that was just very, very different. I didn't need to say to him, look, these people also have concerns, and just stop and listen. He could see that for himself. He could feel the dynamic in the room. At the same time, people feel constrained from speaking freely sometimes, of course, when they're worried about the reaction. And, I do believe in meeting people on their own terms as well, where they can tell me, well, actually, I don't like these people. But, you know, like my dad, I'm not a great believer in memorandums of understanding. These people would not be in the room if I said, be part of a group and sign your name here so you're going to behave. Keep it fluid and informal. Let's not codify these relationships. There's a guy who came with severe dementia once to a project I was working on, and I thought, oh gosh, this is going to be pretty challenging. But at one point he spoke up incredibly clearly about something no one else had said, and it was really powerful. And he would never sign a code of conduct or a sort of memorandum. Informality, I think, can operate on lots of different levels. Involving people with building work, for instance, doesn't have to be a health and safety nightmare. And I think this idea that you can just do things simply as human beings and trust them, it's powerful. This is really just an excuse to show you my two kids, actually, because this is their school where we designed and we built a project, and that's one of the neighbours, our neighbours from down the road, who came and did the digging for us for free, and that's the school caretaker/cleaner, who is also the documentary photographer of everything that happens on the school site. And, you know, you can run a site with no hard hats, no CDM coordinator, no health and safety manual, no contract, actually nothing really written down at all, just with your friends and your neighbours and the kids and whoever wants to come along. But that's important, just sometimes to just do it. Everyone knows the story of Sleeping Beauty. And as in Sleeping Beauty, there's always a fairy who hasn't been invited to the party and who resents this and who turns up and puts her hex on you. And you simply can't find and talk to everybody that matters. That is a totally futile aim to set oneself and completely impossible. When, you know, we've had projects where we've had everybody on board and that one bad fairy turns up and the dynamic just blows apart. But, you know, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the bad fairy and how you would feel, how maybe you felt at school when you were left out of that conversation in the corner of the playground and you didn't really understand why no one had asked you. And actually, they didn't mean not to ask you, they just didn't really realise that you wanted to be part of it. But it felt hurtful, and these things are human emotions. We have to kind of look back to those tales and those things that are very psychologically deeply rooted. And then we can find the way to treat those people as kindly, in fact more kindly, and embrace them into the process even more. I don't think that non-professionals can't understand complex issues. You can just take time to explain them clearly as grown-ups, and even kids can understand money, time, regulations, what is and isn't possible. And I strongly believe that the only way that anybody can make an informed decision is to empower them with understanding. Sometimes you have to be a teacher, but a good teacher treats their students as equals. And I think architects in the room, this also goes for all the information and the drawings and the design work you show. If it isn't good enough for a crit of your most respected peers or for the cover of an architectural magazine, it's not good enough to show to a group of community members either. How can you expect anyone to get excited by, let alone understand your ideas, if you can't show them in a way that they relate to? Now here I did want to show you some really terrible examples, which I've seen in my career, but I thought that would be really unfair to the architects who've done them. So you're just going to have to imagine them. But, you know, glossy CGIs, actually people don't believe in glossy CGIs. Don't put people with pretty lighting in dusk shots. Don't put people with balloons. Put those in the ones that you can give to the money men, because money men love pictures of people in balloons looking happy at dusk and everything glows. But community members, normal people out there, just go, it never looks like that round here. Show them the site when it's grey and it's raining, and if it still looks good in a visualisation when it's grey and raining, then maybe it might actually be good. Models are really good, and you can explain a lot with a model. Everyone understands a model. It feels real. You can walk around it. You can peer into it. You can't hide its bad angles. Everybody loves a good model. And treating everyone as kids isn't, of course, it's not just the grown-ups. It is the kids, literal kids as well. Ask them complex questions and you'll get complex answers. This is from this school project. I could have shown you many more like it. This is a group of residents, you know, who are telling us things that are ideas. And don't dismiss those ideas. They're not ridiculous. Actually, they might be pretty smart, just because they say, well, why didn't you put that there? And you think, oh my goodness, you know, Urban Design 101 tells us not to do that. But actually, it might be pretty smart. I love the fact that kids can give you these amazing feedback that is just as sophisticated as anything from an adult, and actually treat kids as adults, and they are the future. So just winding up a little bit now and going back to the bigger picture, you know, this is a really interesting question, because I'm actually not an advocate for purely localised decision-making. For me, that does quickly turn into parochialism and NIMBYism, and people are understandably, as we've talked about before, selfish. And I think fundamentally my role in my projects that I work on, or that I'm asked to become involved in, or when I give advice, I try to say, look, you know, our role is to speak up for the people who aren't in the room, and that's not just, you know, the fact that we haven't managed to get enough young people or enough black people or whoever to come to some event. That's actually the wider community of the city, the country, the region. You know, there are people who need stuff that involves compromise. They're not in the room. They are the homeless on the streets. They are lots of different people who are in need. And what balance should be struck between the big picture and the parochial is the key question, isn't it? And I'm constantly answering the question to people saying, why us? Why our community? Why are you building here? Why aren't you building down the road? We kind of just want a few bits to change, but we don't really want all of this other stuff that comes with it. And the suspicion that ultimately a community will be done to, just as they always have had things done to them, is totally understandable and well-founded. And it's the hardest question of all. But I think we can't see ourselves as conduits for just letting people or allowing people, advocating for people to get what they want. Kids want sweets. Grown-ups want their patch made nice and left well alone. And the hardest and I think most important questions are actually about privilege, when you're talking with people who feel they have no privilege at all. And they're not perhaps seeing that there are people who have other needs and other lacks or other lacks of privilege who aren't in the room and who need to be spoken for. I came across this brilliant quote in a publication about regeneration recently, and I thought it was really interesting. This question about can you or should you or how do you legitimise disadvantage for a minority in favour of benefits for a majority? And the question of what is democratic in that process too. Because the participatory work, such as the projects that I work on, they are frequently accused of being sort of manipulative and politically convenient. And, you know, if you were being cynical, you might compliment this phrase by saying participation is an undemocratic process that softens the disadvantage suffered by a minority while leaving the power of the majority almost untouched. I'm not wholly as cynical as that, because I actually do mostly believe that the people who pay my fees and commission me to do projects, do actually want to make a better place. You know, they want to address the housing crisis, they want to leave a benefit from development, they want to create better opportunities and aspirations and solve deprivation and poor health and all of this within a climate of no money and government and all the rest of it. You know, but I do understand this question about, am I really wasting my time, and am I wasting the time of all the people who work on these projects with me and all the people who I go and have tea with and I take up their time with meetings and exhibitions and events and workshops and goodness knows what. I do think that projects are, such as mine are, they are a tiny drop in the ocean, but they do try and bridge this gap between the political and the personal. They're about empowering and skilling citizens with knowledge and confidence so that they can go out and take direct action in their own lives. And they're also about trying to bring about that wider change that solves, or at least addresses, big picture problems in a way that is least damaging to those who feel its consequences most severely. And I don't think that that's a bad thing, you know. We need to soften the edges of these macro forces. And I am a pragmatist, and I do insist on seeing value in bringing people together to talk and discuss and disagree and see things, however briefly, from a perspective that's not their own. I also wholly stand up for the right of people, of course, to protest and take direct action, and in fact it's something that I reserve for myself, and I have reserved for myself on projects in the past, to step out of a project when actually the premise is going all wrong. I think we can act pragmatically on the ground as well as challenging that big picture, and those things are not mutually exclusive, the direct action and the pragmatic project work. People say lots of lovely things to me, you know, and they keep me sort of going when I'm doing all of the work that I do. But this was great. This came from a person who was involved in a project And I really loved it. Grammar and spelling and all the rest of it intact. You know, if a few people who might have otherwise passed unseeing on the street as a result of something that we can do in our work, stop and talk to each other, I think that that's really meaningful. I think it might actually help stitching some of these rather troubling divides that exist and lead us to some kind of shared understanding. And maybe that will persuade people and show, just through their daily life, that we're better at participating than standing aside. And that's what I'm going to end on. Do you want me to go away?
No, you can stay. Okay, thank you very much, Hannah, and thanks for making the discussion personal to you and your family system. I was very struck by your dad's articulation of the good company, and it struck me as you were talking, you were kind of laying out a manifesto almost about a good system. So there's an embedded practice, but there's also codified practice, you know, structural practice, civil servants. I was recently in a discussion about inequalities in Scotland, and just to kind of cut to the chase, there are shitloads of them. and not as a kind of disgrace, to be fair, in the 21st century, in a small country, that there are so many of them, and they hit so many people in so many different ways. And in this discussion were a bunch of civil servants, and the civil servants said, the most difficult thing for us around how we manage legislation is the loneliness of our intent and the action. So it is not that there are other people wanting to not care, is that there are many distances between the people who are trying to do something and what's happening on the ground. So I was really struck by your idea of the good system and rooting that in your family system. It would be really great just to open it to the floor. There was a whole ton of stuff there. Maybe just to kind of anyone with some questions. I'm going to put on a hat in a little while that challenges all of it and says no way. But before we do that, it would be really good just to kind of engage with you. Any questions? Please, Alex.
Hey.
My question was whether you were being invited or whether you were inviting
in the sense of client, as it were? Or in the sense
not the client, the communities that you work with.
Yeah.
Are you invited by them
Mixture.
to talk about it, or is it the inverse?
Real mixture. I mean, I think the way that I get involved with projects is a really varied one. So some of them are client, if you like, power-led projects where an organisation of some sort, whether it's a public sector or a private sector organisation, a developer or a housing association, wants to do a project and they want to find a way of making that either, through instrumentally needing it to be less controversial or through a genuinely well-meaning process of wanting to make it participatory to do it. But equally, sometimes, and particularly locally to where our practice is based, we work at the invitation of community organisations themselves, of grassroots organisations themselves, who, we very actively network and put ourselves out there as a resource locally. So a good example of that would be a group of residents who wanted to form a community land trust locally, and they're just normal people, have no idea kind of where to start with any of that stuff. So they invited me to be part of their group at the early stages to help bring some experience and perspective to that, and also some skills. So we did some mapping work for them. We did some, I talked to them about some other case studies of places and how the planning process works and all of these sorts of things. Really, it's about demystifying, for that particular group, it was about demystifying what on earth they were getting themselves involved with. So it's a real variety. And I think it's interesting that there's a lot of support for community-led groups in the UK at the moment, which I see as actually a little bit of a devolution of responsibility from government, if I might say so. I like community-led projects, but I think the idea that if your community doesn't have the capacity to get up of its own accord and initiate its own project, then somehow, sorry, you're on your own. You had your chance. You should have formed your neighbourhood plan, or you should have formed your community land trust. If you haven't got the time because you're all too busy earning a crust, tough is an interesting challenge, but we work with those groups too.
Okay, so any other questions? Stefan.
Hi. To go to that point about devolution of responsibility, because you talked mainly about how you're sort of doing all this work on sort of the front end or the tip of the spear, sort of in the community, engaging like participation, all that. And I'm wondering, do you also do more the back end as well, which is looking the other way from the community, but towards the council, towards the mayor of London, towards the boroughs and everything? Because you didn't talk about that, and I wonder if that's also sort of equally as important in order to tackle essentially what you're talking about, which is that
The
devolution of
systemic
responsibility.
problem. Yeah. Really interesting question. I mean, I think my personal perspective on that is that I could spend my life talking to people and go. I mean, of course I do talk to, and I've done projects for the mayor and I've done projects for, research projects or whatever for policy type stuff. But I could spend my entire life doing all of that and actually get very little satisfaction out of it, if I'm honest, and see very little impact on the ground because, anyone who's worked with well, certainly our UK government will know that it's a pretty frustrating process. I'm most interested in doing things that actually have real impact on the ground for people's lives. And I think that through doing those projects, you are showing something to government. You are demonstrating something that you can then take out of that sphere and say, look, we've done something really interesting here. Come and have a look at it. And, it's amazing how civil servants, they just don't really know what's out there. So the more one can do and then kind of just give it to them in nice bite-sized packages of a few slides that they can show the minister, that's kind of more powerful than just trying to talk about it theoretically. But it's a challenge. I don't have a good answer to that. How do our politicians start discussing all of this?
But I guess it lends itself to saying that your story seems very powerful as an embedded practice at community level, making an action. And then your kind of question relates to the system. So it kind of lends itself to saying maybe there are a team of different people in this kind of practice, more embedded, more in between, and actually an embedded practice within government. So if you don't have empathy within government,
yes, absolutely,
nobody really cares about what's happening on the ground because we don't do it that way. So practice on the ground, bridge between, and empathy in the system. Yeah. And that seems to be, your dad said, that when he walked across, it's about bridging common interest or a way of so maybe there's a structure and that in that we individually can't expect to change everything. No. But we probably should be talking about a kind of practice that allows it to move around.
What that platform might look like, if there can be a crossover platform between the two. It's an open question, I guess.
Well, I think we're always trying to make links with people who kind of share those interests. And I think one of the just on a practical level, one of the challenges is that the people within government change so quickly that you can make a relationship with one person and then they're gone a few months later. A minister is gone, a civil servant is gone. These people just... This is so difficult to actually get any traction. And there are a few examples of people who have been really instrumental within local or regional government in embedding some really interesting thinking. And I have nothing but the hugest admiration for those people, but wow, the system is definitely against them.
So perhaps that's an opportunity for us to talk about today is what platform, to do this kind of stuff, and then what are the practices at the different scales. Back to the challenge, I know we're going to move on to the next speaker. If I was, as I am, part of a quango within the system of government, which I am, and I talk to some of my colleagues, they would say, that was a very well articulated presentation and good for you. And they would say, but the disbenefits of that is it takes tons of time, it costs tons of money, it raises tons of expectation, and we fundamentally don't believe that the people who don't know what we have to do are as smart as us. So with all due respect, we like that you're doing it, but we're not. So the question is, how do we engage with that type of mentality? That's a real mentality, and that mentality holds levers of influence and power. And it's not that they're not interested, but that is there. So that they will argue the disbenefits. What could we do to engage?
So the presentation I showed you was the presentation for you, not the presentation that I give very often on the other side of that room to those sorts of people. you know, and that presentation is about instrumentalism. Fundamentally, it is about, you know, you will reduce the maintenance costs of your project if the people who live around it are invested in it, because they won't graffiti it and they won't piss all over it and they won't break the windows. It is, your project will get through planning quicker and less expensively, and you won't have bad press for your mayor or your borough leader who has an ego the size of Great Britain, and he will be happy because, you know, he can have this nice shiny project that he can cut the ribbon on that everyone is okay with. And for me, this is where I think I'm happy, I'm completely comfortable with, if you like, the lack of integrity that might be implicit in that, to say I can totally give that worldview to those people, as well as I can totally believe in myself on something else.
Which is great, because I think that if we don't have that ability, we have a problem.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
There's something really powerful coming out around these questions around.
But I would love more data, coming back to data on actually saying, you know, and I think as a profession we're terrible at sharing data that says actually this does have measurable benefits, measurable money, time, effort benefits to your community.
So brilliant. So we've got something on data on the measurable benefits, but also within that, I would say not to miss the benefits that happen, the consequences of this are benefits which were not necessarily the program intent. There's something around what platforms allow us to kind of pull this stuff together. There is the honesty of the discussion in practice at the different levels, and then there's how we tell the benefit story at different levels. Okay, so all excellent. Thank you very much. Could I just ask a round of applause for fantastic.
Thank you very much.